Welcome back to my reading of Auralia's Colors. There are a couple of things I'd like to share today before we read together Chapter 7, Night on the Lake. One is I happen to be wearing a t-shirt today from a concert by Over the Rhine in celebration of their album, The Trumpet Child. And I figure I should mention as I continue to read some of the inspirations, some of the voices, some of the muses, really, that influenced the arc of the Auralia thread all the way through all four books of it. I don't know that there is any band, any musical act in the world that influenced the Auralia thread more than the band Over the Rhine. They are Linford Detweiler and Karen Bergquist. They have many albums going back, wow, all the way to the early 90s, late 80s, actually. They like to claim they're an 80s band, even though they formed right at the end of the 80s. Anyway, their album, The Trumpet Child, has some songs, some lyrics that were very much on my mind as I was writing. But actually, you can find echoes of many of their songs in these stories. In fact, there are even some, you might call them Easter eggs in the books that are little nods to Over the Rhine fans who are reading. So if you enjoy the Auralia thread, I highly recommend you explore the albums of Over the Rhine. And I don't know, maybe if you are already a fan of Over the Rhine, that's an indication you might find something in these books. I don't want to presume, but maybe. The other thing I want to mention before I read today is the passing of Ian Holm. Ian Holm is one of, in my opinion, the great actors that has ever lived. I'm not narrowing that to screen because I know he was also a great stage actor. But Ian Holm appeared in many of my favorite films. I know I'm going to forget some important ones here, but just off the top of my head, I probably first encountered him in the movie Chariots of Fire as the coach Sam Musabini. But I think even before that, I knew his voice because there was a great BBC recording dramatization of The Lord of the Rings. And so Ian Holm's voice is the voice that I associate with the character of Frodo. Interesting, because many years later, he would become even more famous for playing yet another hobbit in The Lord of the Rings. When I was in college, my friends and I, who were big Lord of the Rings fans, we used to sort of what we call Dreamcast, which is actually a thing in the world of the Dark Crystal, but that means something different there. We would dreamcast the Lord of the Rings. We would say, if there were Lord of the Rings movies, I mean, that seems impossible, but who would we want to cast to play our favorite characters? And I was always quick to say, I think Ian Holm, he was a great voice for Frodo years and years ago, but I think he looks great as Bilbo. I would cast him as Bilbo Baggins. And so it was kind of a dream come true when Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films arrived and Ian Holm was cast as Bilbo Baggins. I also used to say that I thought Ian McKellen should play Gandalf, and lo and behold, there he is. And whereas my friends all thought it should be Sean Connery. No. And I also used to dream of seeing Daniel Day-Lewis play Aragorn. And while Viggo Mortensen certainly gave a memorable performance and made a very distinctive Aragorn, not quite the way I'd pictured him in the books, but I admire that performance. I always pictured Daniel Day-Lewis because of what he did in The Last of the Mohicans, but also just his capacity to create fully original interpretations of characters that only he could have come up with. And apparently Peter Jackson approached Daniel Day-Lewis. There are rumors, reports that almost happened. So anyway, all that to say, Ian Holm was brilliant as Bilbo Baggins. Uh, Perhaps my favorite screen performance of his is in the movie Alien. He is terrifying and subtle, and gives a speech in that film that I think is profound. Of course, he's also in Time Bandits. He's in The Fifth Element, where he's very, very funny. He's in Brazil, where he's very, very strange. When I posted on Facebook about his passing, people were quick to remind me about his great leading performance in the film The Sweet Hereafter. Probably, maybe as far as his acting goes, the most nuanced and perhaps significant performance of his. Anyway, it is heavy on my heart that I will not see Ian Holm in another great screen performance. I can imagine him playing the character of Char Ben Frey in Auralia's Colors. Um, I think I might have other actors in mind for that character as well, but he would definitely be on the short list. All right, we are here not for me to dream about movie versions of my book, which aren't likely to happen, and that is okay with me, because it's more important to me that you are painting pictures in your own imaginations. And if there were to be an Auralia's Colors film, I'm often asked who I would want to see direct it, and I don't imagine that working unless it was an animated film in the style of Miyazaki's Spirited Away. That's kind of how I imagine the look, the feel of a big screen Auralia's Colors. This is a very cinematic chapter. Night on the Lake. In fact, as I've browsed around the internet, I have found some art students who have in their undergraduate portfolios, illustration portfolios, taken on images from Auralia's Colors as challenges. And there is a beautiful image out there. If you do some searching for Auralia or Ale Boy, you'll probably find it. There is a beautiful portrayal from this chapter of the Ale Boy sitting on his raft out on Deep Lake under a starry sky. Chapter 7, Night on the Lake. 2 moons shone on the night the Ale Boy received his unusual orders. One rang out in the black sky, sharp and clear as an owl's cry. The other, an echo of the first, rested uneasily on the glassy surface of the lake. The forest held its breath so that any ripple on the water indicated a presence, a movement, evidence of something, a gator, a rat, an eel, a fish, in a dive, or on the rise. The Ale Boy pushed the last crate of bottles off the edge of the dock and onto the rocking raft. Sweat ran cold down his back. He pulled on his heavy winter cloak, and when his head came up through it, he saw that the dock's duty officer had come to watch him. The guard frowned his trained suspicion, but his scowl had no effect on the boy, who had yet to see a smile from anyone on this day of endless errands. You could have helped me, the boy thought, but did not say. The guard scowled deeper, as though he had heard the words anyway, or perhaps it just looked that way in the wavering torchlight. He wore a blue stripe. He answered directly to the captain of the guard. The Ale Boy glanced around to see if Ark Robin was near. He was beginning to wonder why it was so hard for him to stray beyond the watch of the captain or his officers. Was he under suspicion? Had he been observed collecting ale from the leaking slats of neglected barrels? Had someone witnessed him slipping samples to the gatherers? I'm to remind you, show some caution on the water and report anything suspicious. Suspicious, sir? He wished he had not heard the warning. Is there something wrong on the lake? The guard watched the moon's reflection and slowly shook his head. Personally, I'd give you a different warning. Pay no heed to rumors, but Captain Ark Robin is particularly interested that you stick to your duties. Did he say why? Smirking, the guard gestured to the array of bottles on the raft. More information will cost you, ale boy. 1 bottle, and your sworn secrecy. Do you know how hard it is for soldiers to earn king's brew? Where the dock met the shadowing land, a Vaughn slurped at the shoreline sand. The guard groaned. No, don't go swallowing that shell-littered sludge, you buckethead. He stormed back toward the animal. The Vaughn whip came free of his belt, and whack! It was clear to the ale boy that he and his business had been forgotten. He unwound the rope from the anchor post and stepped onto the raft. With the single oar, he pushed off. The sound of water lapping at the underside of the dock grew quieter as the raft cut a silver V through reflections of constellations. For a few moments, silence swelled until he heard only the occasional slice of his oar, the quiet tapping of bottles in the crate, and the faint squeals of bats zigzagging across the water. He lifted the oar and stood still, banishing all thoughts of the guard's warning. This moment here, this span between the dock and the destination was too fragile, too precious. He knew they would come. They always did in moments like this, without invitation, without explanation. Tears. Tears wavering and blurring the stars under the unblinking stare of the 2 white eyes, the moon in the sky and the moon in the water. No one could command him or expect anything of him. No blue-striped officer could spy on his activity. No one could hurt him or ridicule him for his smallness, his weakness. No one's shared laughter could remind him of his loneliness. No one's stature or success could tell him what he might have been if only his life had begun differently. The raft moved like a long, slow sigh, careless, unobserved. The stillness did not last. A placid patch of stars on the lake quivered, sending a shudder through the field of lights. From the size of the disturbance, it was clear that something approached, purposeful, aware. He had heard rumors of enormous creatures sighted from the walls of House Bel Amica, the smooth, gleaming arch of a leathery back breaking the surface of the western sea. Behemoths, they called them. But no such creatures lurked beneath this quiet lake. He fought the fear that froze him, jumped between some ale crates, crouched low. The loudest sound in the darkness was his frantic, beating heart. Just moments later, the stars stilled their crazy dance, drew together again, held their places. The slight rocking of the raft slowed. He huddled mouse-like on the edge of the raft as it slowly turned. He eyed the obsidian water. Pale points of reflected starlight might instead be eyes. A spiky tree branch breaking the surface might not be a branch at all. Soon there were other sounds, distant voices of the young women on the royal float in the middle of the lake. Though he could not discern the reason for their laughter, he felt they laughed at him, laughed for how he cowered before the slightest disturbance. The royal float was a broad wooden platform on a tether fastened to a far-off dock. Kept by the king for special private night occasions or for entertaining privileged guests and visitors, it rested within arrow-shot of a duty guard in a solitary floating watchtower. The guard crouched like a watchful cliff hawk, protecting a nest, just far enough out to be kept from overhearing the conversations of the favored company. The float was decorated with white flame torches, lined by a brass rail, and covered by a canvas to catch untimely rain. The ale boy hated the float, for no one went out on it for an evening without requesting more drink than was appropriate. Tonight, the float's honored passengers would receive these bottles of royal apple twist and raise glasses in honor of the promised. The king had selected the town's most celebrated young woman to marry Prince Calraven, Stricia, daughter of Captain Ark Robin. She had made great show of admiration for the prince. She earned honors by turning in lawbreakers, including palace servant women she caught exchanging a share of their best-colored linens rather than delivering them to the king as required. Stricia's beauty was unmatched. Narrow and sparkling ice-blue eyes, wide lips framing a generous smile, and a river of golden hair braided elaborately about her head and down her back. In a realm where subjects were uniformly bound in gray and brown, the gleam of a person's hair could be an arresting distinction. Stricia's tresses looked as though they were spun from sunlight. Her beauty was not unknown to the ale boy, but neither was her laugh, a proud jay's cackle that clamored across the lake. Stricia's chosen attendants passed around a stretch of fabric from the looms where her wedding gown was even now being prepared, a train of gold that shimmered under the moonlight as though it should burn their hands. The ale boy could see their wide eyes and gaping mouths as they adored the fabric. He could see envy in their eyes, wistfulness, as though they were suddenly remembering something precious they had lost. "The only thing better than the touch of this gown against your skin," sighed one of the ladies, "will be the feel of Prince Calraven's arms around you as you wear it." The ale boy winced. Of all the intolerable talk, the cursing of the gatherers, the bickering of soldiers, nothing soured his stomach faster than the empty, predictable chatter of young housefolk. "Oh, stop your gushing, Danae," Stricia whispered unconvincingly. "Have you thought about the burdensome stones I'll have to wear around my neck? How I'll have to eat with ridiculous manners while wearing rings on each of my fingers." She gasped. "Imagine walking down the street so visible and so distracting. I'll long to go back to being one of the common, and it'll be even worse when I'm queen." "It's been so long since the train of a queen's dress has trailed along the palace corridors," sighed another attendant. "I used to know when Queen Geraldine was passing our quarters by the sound of silky fringe brushing the floor." The attendants gave a collective shudder of lust and envy, whether more for the thought of the throne, the prince, or the gown. The ale boy was uncertain. Their excitement unsettled the float, spreading ripples that rocked his raft as he coasted to a stop against the platform. "The ale boy!" they chorused. "There'll be pear cider with your breakfast," Danae laughed. "White wine with your midday meal, red wine with your supper, perhaps even hajka." "The king never shares his hajka," Stricia sighed. "You would best gain Calraven's word that he won't be so stingy," another interjected, kneeling to be closest to the raft. The ale boy wondered how much strength it would require to tip the float and send the women sliding into the lake. He reached into a bag and withdrew 3 bottles of apple twist, set them in a glittering row on the edge of the float. Then he reached in again, found a rack of 5 clay sipping cups. He ignored the continuing gossip, uncorked the first bottle with a metal hook, let the sighing rush rise, tipped the bottle over the line of cups, then stopped. Stricia stood over him, laughing, holding another bottle, demanding the opener. He started to argue, but she snatched it from him and, as if by accident, kicked the tray of cups back into his boat. "We will drink from the bottles, thank you. You can row on back and do whatever boys like you do at night." "You'll have to stop dreaming about Stricia, though," said Danae, who was enfolding the guest of honor in her arms as if to protect her. "She's been promised, you know. And that means the rest of these magnificent girls will win the love of soldiers, Strisha announced, overjoyed, and the ensuing gleeful outcry could surely be heard on all sides of the lake as the women argued over their potential pairings. The maidens drained the bottle and opened the next before the ale-boy could untie his raft from the float's edge. Their mirth and gossip increased, and he scowled. A precious vintage, gulped down the way laborers guzzled ale in the drinking huts after harvest was done. The royal brewer, Obsidia Dram, came to mind, a round and dusty woman, like a beer keg with leathery gloves for hands. He remembered the brewer roaring to any who would listen, "Royal apple twist should be held a while so the chill goes off, then sniffed and lightly sipped to let its flavor explore the tongue and the crannies, and then there would be broken glass in the brewery if Obsidia caught wind of this evening's reckless waste." He trained his gaze on the dark shore, wondered if a bottle of apple twist would be payment enough to hire a thief from among the gatherers to steal this exquisite cloth so he could bring it to a different kind of young woman, one who knew to savor the color of the king's ales. He had thought of Auralia often since that day a season past, when her fingers had brushed his brow. The light of the float faded behind him. The torchless shadow of the guard's tower loomed close. The silhouette of the standing guard leaned over him. "Shouldn't you be serving the ladies?" "Pardon, sir, but the ladies would not be served. Took the bottles and told me to go." The guard grunted his disgust, which the ale-boy presumed was directed at the promised and her company. He held the oar in the water to keep from departing until dismissed. "Well, then, it must be nice having a bottle in hand to make these long nights easier. Makes me thirsty just thinking about it." The ale-boy could be punished for delivering his cargo to anyone but the assigned party. The trap being set for him was all too familiar. To go one way ensured a good bruising, but to go the other would ensure another good bruising. "Well, there is another crate of apple twist bottles that I was unable to deliver." "I can't imagine they've all survived the ride without a crack. Let me take one of those casualties off your hands. And not a word about it, understand? If it's found missing, for all you know, the party knocked an empty bottle overboard." The ale-boy thought it best to give no more words to this exchange. He quietly lifted a bottle and stepped to the edge of the raft. In that moment, several things happened at once. The guard climbed down the iron ladder, holding a higher rung with one hand while reaching out to the ale-boy with the other. The tower tipped ever so slightly with the shift of the weight. The ale-boy held the neck of a bottle out to the groping shadow. A great wave swelled abruptly behind the raft and raised it as lightly as if it were a leaf. The tower, a much heavier obstacle, lurched in the disturbance, casting the guard, bottle in hand, smack into the upward swell, and he disappeared without a cry. The ale-boy managed an "oh" before the raft slid down the back of the wave and sent him tumbling off the edge. The raft spun off into the darkness, away from the tower, away from the float, and away from the shore, bottles rolling and clinking against each other like alarm bells. The ale-boy had nearly burnt to death in a fire. The scar on his forehead was his souvenir, a reminder of that agony. He was surprised how similar it felt to drown in the cold lake. Water filled his ears, turning him deaf to the sound of his struggle. It poured in through his nose, and he choked cries that became undulating balloons of air rising up toward the surface. His cloak seemed made of chains, sinking him. Something like a tight fist had closed around his left ankle, pulling. He went still from fear, for there was something in the water with him, and it was not the duty guard. He could hear something, a voice, a low humming, a rumble, a deep song. He opened his eyes, expecting to see nothing but the moon's pale impression, like a shining coin floating above him. But there was something else, an immense shadow passing between him and the surface. He felt compelled to call out, but he had no strength. A strong current sent him spinning upward, and he found himself drawing in lungfuls of night air. Something bumped against his head, driftwood perhaps, and his feet kicked against rising ground. He splashed forward 3 steps before falling, his legs half dead. He lunged onto a shore of smooth, slippery stones. The waves washed in and around and over him and then receded, and he was left there, soaking in the shallows, icy lake water running out of his head through his nose and ears, his heavy coat holding him down. Soon I will be able to feel again, he thought, watching his desperate breaths puff away in the breeze. That will hurt. His body felt like that of an old, enormous man. One foot was still held fast. With quivering fingers, he untangled a rope from his ankle and realized it was the tie to the bag that held the clay sipping cups and some flasks of ale. They rattled together like shells as he felt around inside. They were all there. 2 of 14 cups were broken, but at least the disaster was not a total loss. He tried again to stand, but made it only to his knees. He blinked and made sense of the high shadow wall, cliffs with caves gouged in the base. The moonlight they reflected was full of soft colors. He looked back and saw nothing but the quieting waters and the lights of the royal float. So far in the distance, they might have been fireflies clustered on a lily pad. And then the trembling took over. Water trickled off his skin, and yet he felt colder. He clutched the bag against him, evidence that he was still alive, still the ale boy, still a person of some responsibility. But nothing could ever be the same. For now he knew with certainty that something hid beneath those waters. His face was wet with tears as he shook from the impact of betrayal. The adults had lied, and he had been punished a time or 2 for suspecting what was indeed true. And of hope. In his dreams, the creature had been gentle and sheltering. A warmth encircled him, heavy, soft like a blanket. It was a blanket. And there was that soft voice of welcome. I hoped you would visit me. She was saving him again, wrapping him in warmth. She crouched beside him, a hunched figure in a hooded robe, woven with all kinds of darkness. But you could have come by land, you know. I'm not so hard to find. She was already busy collecting wet, sharp-edged shells that the waves had given the shore. Really, she laughed, the keeper should be more careful. And that is chapter 7.